Welcome into Courtside Seats with Kroeger,
a Charlotte Hornets podcast.
Here he is, Chris Kroeger.
All right, it's been a long time coming to talk to this guy as we jump into another episode of Courtside Seats, our Charlotte Hornets podcast. And this guy is a fantastic writer. He's got a lot of great books that are out there right now. And it's not all just basketball, though he's got a fantastic basketball book out, Boys Among Men, which is just one of my favorites. He's got a new book out on The Wire as well, and when he's not doing that, he's writing awesome features on the NBA for Bleacher Report. We got Jonathan Abrams with us on Courtside Seats. Jonathan, what's up, man? How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So it's cool to say this, too. You're kind of based right here. You write nationally, and you're an author and all that, but Charlotte's kind of home to you, so we're reaching right in our own backyard on this episode of the podcast.
I know. I want to just close the door behind me. I don't want too many people to know how awesome of a city Charlotte is. But yeah, we made the jump about 3 years ago and have really loved the city.
So this is a totally different vibe. You're from where? Southern California originally, right?
Yeah, I'm from Southern California. I lived in New York for about 5 years, and me and my wife were looking for a good place to raise the young ones and settled on Charlotte.
It's just amazing, I think, too, like for the line of work you're in, which is you're on the go, maybe not all the time, but like if you want to go cover a story or do a feature, you got a great one up on Victor Oladipo right now on Bleacher Report. Like if you want to go somewhere and go spend 3, 4, 5 days, a week somewhere and just dive in on a story you're going to write, I mean, Charlotte's great, right? You're like the airport we got here. It's so easy to get flights in and out of. It's conducive. Like no flights, unless you're going cross country out to the West Coast. Like every flight's within a couple of hours from where we're at. Like Charlotte's probably got to be perfect for your line of work.
It is perfect, and sometimes it's amazing. You know, it's like an hour and a half to everywhere. And sometimes I don't even realize it. I remember one time I had to book a flight to Chicago, and I was like, it's only like an hour and a half or so to
Right.
Chicago. So, you can get to almost any NBA city within a couple hours.
Did you always want to be a writer? Where did your love for writing come from?
Yeah, I mean, growing up, I love sports and I love to read and write. And if I wasn't going to be good enough to play a sport, I figured that writing about sports would be the next best thing. So back when I was making my college decision, I majored in print journalism, which is how long ago I went to college when there was actually still a print journalism to major in. And I pretty much knew right then that I wanted to write for newspapers.
Were you always a basketball fan specifically as a kid, or were you more just general sports fan as a kid growing up?
It's funny because growing up, baseball was my sport.
Okay.
I was a diehard Dodgers fan. I wanted to write about baseball. I remember even in college, I had never taken Spanish classes in school, so I started taking Spanish classes on the side in college just so I could try to be able to talk to most of the baseball players in a baseball locker room. But then I covered a couple games when I was an intern at the Los Angeles Times, and I learned very quickly that being a baseball writer, especially in those days, just takes over your life like nothing other, where you're at the baseball stadium 5-6 hours before the game starts, and there's no clock like in basketball, so you don't know when you're going to get out. And I always compare that being in a baseball locker room is kind of like being at an awkward middle school dance where the players don't want to talk to you and you don't really want to be there, but you just have to be there in case somebody speaks to somebody who you're trying to talk to. So it's just a really weird environment that I quickly found out probably wasn't going to be a long-term good investment for myself.
So then when did you first cover, let alone basketball, but like the NBA? When was your first time covering an NBA game?
So when I was doing the internship at the LA Times, I covered a couple basketball games during that internship. And then I got lucky because about a year afterwards, they trusted me to cover the Clippers as the paper's beat writer. So that was 2007, 2008. It was a very, very bad Clippers team, and I'm sure they figured, let me just give this job to this young kid, and if he messes up, nobody is reading the Clippers anyway, so it won't be that bad of a disaster. But that was the first team I covered on a regular basis.
How surreal was that for you? Well, how old were you at that point?
I was 23, 24, around there.
And you had to be the youngest beat guy in the NBA, right? Full time, like covering an NBA team.
Probably. Probably. It was a lot of fun. They were a really bad team, but they had a lot of good personalities on that team. Elton Brand was hurt that whole year, but he was a great guy to get to know. Really, just my favorite athlete to even cover, and you see all the good things that he's gone on to do with being general manager of the 76ers. And they had Brevin Knight was a guy who went to Stanford who was really good to talk to. They had a lot of interesting guys on that team who collectively they weren't good at playing basketball, but they were good to talk to and good for even Brevin. Like I remember maybe a couple years ago, he's an announcer, I think with the Grizzlies now, where I just thanked him for being that professional to such a young guy who didn't know what he was doing.
But do you think, like, and this is what's funny, I guess you look back on it now and you're grateful for that, but like also at the same time, I'd imagine maybe your age was probably your best ally because at that age, even though some of these guys are older than you, you're probably much more relatable to these players than most of the other guys covering an NBA beat at that time, right?
Yeah, without a doubt, it was an asset at that time where I can, talk to them about music or other stuff, not just NBA. And it's funny because now I'm in my mid-30s, so now I can feel like I can relate to guys in the front office a little bit better than I could back then. I think there's advantages and disadvantages as you go through every stage, and just the good thing about it is to just be professional, and that's something that nobody can take away from you, no matter how old or young you are.
When you first get on the beat and you're covering these games, like how long, you were just talking about how different the dynamic is in a baseball locker room. Like how long did it take you to realize, oh my gosh, these guys, these players in the NBA, they're super accessible. A lot of them are willing to speak their mind. Like this is the complete polar opposite of what I was doing when I was in a baseball clubhouse.
Well, it's not just that. It's also at that stage of the game, it's before social media. So it would be just me and a reporter from the Orange County Register. Usually we're the only two guys in the locker room. And so they see you every day. There's not a million cameras in their face. You could actually have, conversations and get to know these guys a little bit. So, I mean, for me as a young reporter, it was just the perfect recipe to be able to learn and grow and be able to kind of build my identity and do the type of journalism and stories that I enjoy doing.
For you, you've been on the front lines. When you see some of the things like Kevin Durant, when he had his kind of monologue at the press conference stand a few weeks ago for Golden State, and he feels like the media's out to get him and he's being treated unfairly. I think some of that is just a byproduct of the way the game is covered now. But like, how do you specifically, as a guy in this field who knows what that's like to cultivate those relationships, how did you interpret some of that stuff? Knowing you're not around him every day, but just the general idea of the media is my enemy, they're out to get me, you guys aren't treating me fairly. How did you feel about that when Durant was saying some of that stuff a few weeks ago?
Yeah, I mean, I can obviously see how a player feels that way, but I do think it's disingenuous to throw everybody all into one bucket. But to a player, that's what it seems like, right? Mm-hmm. To a player, it can be somebody who's trolling them on social media is thrown into the same boat as somebody who is in the locker room every day, when it shouldn't be categorized all just everybody thrown into the same bucket. ESPN is doing sponsored content with Kevin Durant right now, basically where they're running his show. So how can that be the same, or how can ESPN be out to get them when at the same time, they're in business with Kevin Durant? So it's everything is not the same, but for a player, I can see how it all gets thrown at them at the same time, and they're trying to figure out, almost who can I trust and who can I not.
So when you start to make the transition, you did some work for Grantland, now you're writing for Bleacher Report, and now you do these big, just in-depth features where you just go so deep in these great profile pieces. Do you miss aspects of being on the beat, or does this fulfill you in such a way now where you just absolutely love covering the NBA in this way? Because it's a totally different way of covering the league than you covered it when you first came in.
Yeah, it's really different, and I think there's pros and cons to both. There's nothing like being on a beat and trying to develop relationships and cultivate them over a period of time and earn that trust. And doing features, it's almost like you try to fast track that, where you try to have a person believe that you're trustworthy in a matter of, a day or two instead of over the course of a whole season or months of a season. It's definitely different. There's pros and cons, but at this stage in the game, I would hope that, my reputation precedes me to where if I don't know Victor Oladipo before I go out to do a story on him, I hope that, the Pacers PR guy can sit him down and say, hey, we've worked with Jonathan before. He's a good guy. It's just different. But I do like trying to do these feature stories a lot.
How much of this is it just pops into your head? How much of this is something where you're sitting on a story for a while and you think, I just got to find the right time to unleash it? Where do these ideas for these features come from?
I think a lot of it is back and forth with editors. Maybe there'll be a idea from me or an idea from my editor, or who's playing well right now, who's not getting that much coverage, who maybe deserves it, who has an interesting story to tell. So, and also who will sit down or who has the time to sit down for a story and talk, because, I'm sure that the editors would like feature story on LeBron every day, but
right.
But you also have to deal with reality a little bit.
How often is it where you go to somebody, or you go to a team, or just a person in general? The idea of you go to another party and you say, "Hey, I've got this great idea. I think it's really interesting. I want to tell your story." And you go to them and they just say, "No, I'm not interested." How often does that happen in the process?
I mean, it happens. I don't know how often, but that's something that definitely happens, especially now where players can more expertly control their own narratives and kind of what they want to put out there and what they don't want to put out there. With something like Players Tribune is a great example where they can control every single aspect of that. But I do think that there's, something to be said by having your story told by somebody else, somebody who's going to try to talk to your teammates and your family members and coaches and be able to tell a complete non-judgmental story, but something that is the truth and not just, one-sided. Because when you're in it and in the middle of it, you may not be able to completely see all sides of it. And I think a perfect, example is, Kemba let me tell his story earlier this season, where he also, I think last year, when he wanted to put something up, he wrote for Players Tribune. So I think the players can navigate both and be successful in doing so.
To that end, what did you make basically the end of the summer when the Clippers announced they had hired Lee Jenkins, who is one of the great profilers in our sport, and all of a sudden he goes from SI, the guy that penned LeBron's return to Cleveland, to now working in an NBA front office in a capacity where he's basically going to be storytelling for a team in however they see fit. But how did you interpret that when that happened?
I was happy for Lee, and I'm still happy for Lee because it seemed like something that he was interested in doing, and it sounds like he's going to return to writing at some point. I still don't understand completely what his job is.
Right.
He's been secretive in that regard, but I guess we'll see how it pans out with what the Clippers are able to do this summer. But it's an interesting switch. But I guess it makes sense, right? If you have a guy who's good at telling stories, and if that's what the Clippers felt they needed, you've seen a lot of guys who have analytical backgrounds, who work for media companies, who now work for teams, and it makes sense for teams to try to seek advantages in every area they can find.
All right, let's talk about, you just hinted at it, let's talk about it, because I read it a couple months ago when it came out, and it's great. I know you were around us working on it a little bit and spending a lot of time with Kemba, but your feature that's up on BleacherReport.com, Kemba's Choice, and how long had this one been in the works? How long had you been wanting to tell the story of Kemba Walker, who's one of the great stories in our game? Obviously, I'm around him every day, so I'm spoiled, but how long had this been in the works for you?
It had been in the works for a while. I want to say that I almost was going to do a story on him during his first All-Star appearance, but that fell through. I can't remember if it was on my side or with his agent, but it kind of fell through the cracks. So I had been on that for a while, wanting to do a story on Kemba, just because I do think that he's one of the most overlooked guys in the NBA, and there's only a few guys who can be as good as NBA players as they are while still also feeling relatable to most common people. And I can only think of Kemba and maybe Mike Conley Jr. of just still having that everyday perspective of somebody who you would almost come across on the street, and not having all this fame and fortune kind of impact them too much. And Kemba is definitely one of those guys.
Well, and you spent some time with him. You spent some time with him around the practice facility and some other areas outside of the practice facility. You knew that he's just a little different, but when you really got to spend time around him, did it even surprise you to the extent that he is so private and down to earth? Was it even surpassing what you thought?
Yeah, like one moment in that reporting really sticks out to me, and it was when we had gone to Dave & Buster's where he mentors so a couple things. So he mentors these kids where it's not just a one-off thing. He's staying involved and invested in their lives through the years, and I think that's really something to be said where, it's easy for an athlete to show up to a function and sign some autographs and smile and shake a few hands, but he's really invested in these 4 kids' lives. And so they went out to a Dave & Buster, and it wasn't a busy night at a Dave & Buster, and NBA players are obviously 6'7" or above. They stand out, and Kemba doesn't in that way, but he just goes to like a pop-a-shot and starts shooting baskets, and he's just by himself. He's not drawing any type of crowd. He's just by himself in his element, just lost trying to sink as many shots as he can in this pop-a-shot. And I'm just in my head, I'm like, what other NBA player can do this? If the 13th roster guy on the Lakers tried to do this, he would probably be flooded by people trying to take pictures and stuff. But this all-star can just walk into here in his own city and just do this. That says a lot.
Yeah, and I think you wrote about this in the piece, and Kemba's talked about this. He told me this a few months ago. Part of the reason he loves Charlotte is that he could just do that, and sure, he might get stopped occasionally depending on where he's at. In that instance, he wasn't. But even if he goes to the mall, for example, and I'm not going to say which one because then I'm going to give away the secret. But if he goes to the mall, for example, and he loves to shop, he's told me that's one of his favorite things to do. Like he goes to shop, he's not getting hounded. Like people might stop and see him and say hi or quickly ask for an autograph, but like he's not going to be so deterred in a way where he's like, man, I'm never going out again. So he just loves this idea that not only does he love to be low key, but that the city allows him to be low key, and not because he's not known, but because the city recognizes, I don't know, that you just live your life. This is not a city where people are going to just hound you on every street corner you're in. And even as little of a thing as walking to the mall and going to shop is something that he can do in his own piece right now.
Yeah, and I think saying that, I mean, I wouldn't discount the value of that when this summer comes, where being able to still live the life that you want, it means something, especially when you get to that high of a stature as an NBA player, to still be regular in some regards. I think that means something for him.
I can't remember the exact date this happened, but this was on the Jump a few weeks ago, and a pretty thoughtful conversation was going on with Paul Pierce and Tracy McGrady. And McGrady, a guy that did bounce around a little bit, not a ton, but a little bit. He said, well, what's legendary, right? Like we all use this term legendary or iconic or historic, and how do we define it? And so often, how we define things is with championship rings and accolades individually. And, this league, there's just like such a finite amount of those resources. Not everybody's going to be able to climb to those heights. And it's not a diminishment of your career or anything you've done. But McGrady was saying, look, legendary is also in today's NBA playing an entire career in one uniform. And we just went through this trade cycle with the Grizzlies, and obviously Gasol is gone in Memphis, but I am always struck by the similarities between Kemba and Mike Conley. And if they played on other teams perhaps or in other markets, there's no doubting if you go and look through what they put together for a work throughout their career, I feel like they'd be regarded differently and they'd be thought of differently. But they also can do no wrong because they, I think people respect the fact of how they're doing it and where they're doing it without the fanfare. So there is something legendary to be said about if Kemba Walker truly put together a 10 or 12 year career, if not more than that, entirely in a Hornets uniform and broke every record beyond imagination. There's true value in that. Guys don't do that very often in today's NBA.
No, not at all. And I think that there's, even taking that one step farther, I think there's a lot of value in leading a franchise to their first, because there's not a lot of franchises where you can still accomplish those type of goals to where, like, I know for DeMar DeRozan, he had his heart set on staying in Toronto forever, and he took a lot of value in leading that franchise to a conference finals, or leading that franchise to playoff victories, and getting past those hurdles that nobody else in that franchise had done before, even if it's not a championship, just getting to that stage of respectability throughout the NBA. And
I get to see him all the time. Excuse me, I didn't mean to cut you off. Mm-hmm. I get to see him all the time, but what did you make of the relationship between Kemba and his family, but specifically his mom, who's behind the bench wearing his jersey, screaming at every game? Because that's kind of a unique dynamic at this level.
Yeah, definitely. It just goes to show you what's important in his life, and to have his mom that close for him. I think one of the other stories that I put in the story that I wrote about him was that how his mom had requested that he never get any tattoos in case she ever needs a blood donation from him, and he agreed to it. So it's just a guy who has his head on straight is what I experienced.
One of the other interesting things about Kemba is the fact that he is just come out and done so many things to transform his game. You've been around the league for a while. Steve Clifford, our former head coach, used to talk about Mike Conley a lot, that was the only other player he could remember truly transforming his game, especially from a shooting standpoint, the way Kemba has over the last few years. You've been in the league and around the league for a while. Is there anybody else that comes to mind? Shooting doesn't have to be the example, but that you've seen where they came into the NBA game as thought to be this player, but then after 4 or 5 years, they took a massive hard right turn in a different direction that totally transformed them. Does anybody else come to mind to you? Because it's got to be a short list.
Yeah, it's tough to think of guys who were able to change their career fortune so much, or be able to improve dramatically. Kyle Lowry is somebody who comes to mind, who bounced around at the beginning of his career and looked to be kind of a mid-level type player until he suddenly took off with Toronto. But you're right, that list is certainly small.
When did being an author pop on your mind? Was that always something you had a larger dream for, or did you sort of stumble into this aspect of your career?
I think it goes with the whole, writing from an early age stage, where you read so many books growing up, and as you get older that you get to a point where you say, hey, it'd be cool if I could do this one day. I've read enough of them. Maybe I can do it.
And the book that I told you this before, it's just become one of my favorite, if not the favorite basketball book I've ever read, because I think it really just speaks to, I guess, a turning point in today's NBA. And it's kind of cyclical, because I feel like we're going back to it again in the coming years. But your whole fantastic piece on Boys Among Men, which is basically, and it's the entire history. It's not just, let's go back to the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. You did an entire history dating back to Moses Malone in the 70s about the prep to pro era of the NBA. And when did that one come to mind? This idea that you were gonna truly chronicle this aspect of the basketball world. How long were you working on that one?
So I had done a few features for Grantland, and I noticed that the guys who had jumped straight from high school to the NBA, they usually had more interesting stories in getting to NBA stability, whether it was Sean Livingston or Gerald Green or J.R. Smith or guys like that. They just had more interesting stories. So that was a catalyst that made me kind of want to look up the whole history. And especially since, so I graduated high school in 2001, and I remember that was like, I had been a basketball fan since long before then, but especially then. So I was one of those guys who was looking up high school rankings at the time. And 2001 was the same high school draft class as Tyson Chandler, Eddie Curry, and Kwame Brown. And now, years later, they were once all projected to be, the next Shaq, the next KG, the next whomever, but their careers had spanned off in wildly different directions. So I wanted to take a look at all those guys. So I think those two things provided the catalyst to want to do this book.
What was so interesting to me on a couple of fronts, that was interesting, first of all, because I wasn't expecting that. I think you're right. I think you think of, okay, prep to pro, and for every Kevin Garnett you think of, I think people think of Sebastian Telfair as a guy, well, man, what a bust. But that's what I guess even me as an ardent NBA fan, we throw those players aside, or we did cast those players aside, and yet there were so many of those players, like Sebastian Telfair himself, who went on to have a decent NBA career. Sure, they were never Kevin Garnett, but some of these guys stuck around in the NBA for 5 to 10 years, and if that were any other player not coming out of high school, you would have said, oh, they had a decent NBA career, and yet for some reason we either forgot about those guys or we diminished that as an accomplishment because they weren't this transcendent star, and you had player after player. You had some true busts in there, but even a guy like Kwame Brown that I remember. Kwame, who played for the Bobcats for a little while and had some decent run with the Lakers, he never turned into be what probably he was thought to be in Washington, obviously. But Kwame stuck around in the league for a little while, and there's no shame in that. And you did a great job telling those stories because I think they were forgotten by so many people.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things I was trying to get across where I think the average NBA career is between 3 and 4 years, and you look at Kwame, who is viewed in retrospect as somebody who didn't reach his potential, but he played a dozen years in the NBA, you know? And there's a lot of guys like that. You can go down the list who they weren't, you know, these transcendent all-star players, although some of them were. Some of them were Kobe and KG and LeBron, guys who, you know, were picked early for that stardom and guys who lived up to it and in a lot of cases exceeded it. But then you look at somebody like Al Harrington, who had a very long career for a long time and was a contributing NBA player. And I don't see somebody who failed in their career. I see somebody who made a long career for himself where a lot of other peers, you know, wouldn't be able to hit those high roads that he did and be able to earn that type of salary for as long as they did it had they not declared out of high school.
Was it? I'm remembering off the top of my head here. Al Harrington was he the story that was? Who was he living with the Pacers when he got drafted? He was staying at somebody else's house. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, he was staying at Antonio Davis's house.
So how many of those stories I thought were interesting too, where you found out? Because that's the other aspect of your book that I thought was so interesting, and we're going to get back to this, I suppose, as the early entry rule seems like it's going to change. It's just got to be negotiated by the Players Association too moving forward. But the way teams from team to team handled these high school players, because it seemed as if some teams were willing to put all these constructs and things around them to say, hey, we recognize you're coming from a totally different world. We've really almost got to babysit you in a way. And then there were other teams who thought, you know what, you're now an adult. You made an adult decision. Fall in line, and if you don't, well, that's on you. And I just thought that was such an interesting dichotomy, like team to team, how teams thought they needed to handle some of these players.
Yeah, and that was such a huge difference in a lot of these players' careers, where if a team had that infrastructure there to help them with not even just basketball stuff, just off the court, just, you know, some of these guys didn't have checking accounts before they got $1 million contracts, you know, and in order to stay sane through all that, you need somebody to help lead your hand. So some teams were light years ahead of others, and it made a big difference. I think collectively, if we go back to allowing high schools into the NBA, I think now the NBA is in a such smarter place where I think the infrastructure for high school players transitioning to the NBA will be much, much better than it was before. Because, like, I remember Tyson Chandler telling me that when he landed on the Bulls as a rookie, they had nothing in place for him and Tyson Chandler, to where they just felt like they were alone trying to transition not only just into the NBA, but also having money for the first time in their lives and being an adult for the first time of your life and living alone for the first time in your life. So all these different things are happening all at once. And, you know, I remember where I was when I went to college and when I was a freshman in college, and, you know, I was, you know, a crazy 18-year-old at that time without the money. So I can only imagine, you know, what these guys went through having the money and obviously a lot of time in their day to get into trouble.
One of the other interesting stories that, and maybe this was talked about at the time, although I don't remember it, and so I found this out, I guess, in hindsight, reading your book, was with LeBron in Cleveland, Ricky Davis was like an impediment to him in the locker room, did not want to be helpful, and really was resentful of LeBron and the attention he was getting right away, whether deserved or undeserved. And so the Cavs basically had to just get rid of Ricky Davis because he was getting in the way because he didn't want to help LeBron. And so by not helping him as a veteran in the locker room, he was basically hurting him. And so the Cavs had to basically deal him away to Boston.
Yeah, and that's another facet that, some of these guys had to get. LeBron is like the great outlier in all this, because even guys like Kevin Garnett and Kobe Bryant and Tracy McGrady, they needed time, but LeBron just amazingly just came into the NBA ready to play physically, mentally, emotionally, in all those regards. So, yeah, they had better make way for LeBron at that time. And, Ricky Davis couldn't see it, but luckily Paul Silas was their coach at the time, and he did.
All right, last thing here, and this is kind of I guess it's a mea culpa, and I just got to let this out. Your other book, which is out now, All the Pieces Matter. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's the inside story of The Wire. I've only seen one episode of The Wire. It's the opening episode, and I know I have one of my best friends who used to work as a production assistant on the set of The Wire. It was one of his first jobs out of college. I know this show is iconic. It's arguably the greatest episodic show of all time, depending on who you talk to. I just haven't gotten around to really digging in on it. How did you come to write about The Wire, and what does it represent in your life? Is this just a show that you're so fond of that you had to chronicle it? What's the story on The Wire?
Just the storytelling, the narrative storytelling, how it opened the door for a lot of other shows to almost copycat it, from shows like Breaking Bad to Game of Thrones to a lot of other shows. And it was real. It was based on a lot of truth, and it was created by David Simon, who used to write for the Baltimore Sun and cover homicide and the police in the city, and Ed Burns, a former longtime Baltimore detective. So it was just the recommendation I have, because I hear this a lot from people who haven't been able to get through it, is that you have to make it through the first 4 episodes. The first 4 episodes is all just table setting, where they're introducing you to this world and to these characters. And you make it through the first 4 episodes, and I promise you will not be able to, you'll be complaining to your significant other that you can't sleep at night because you cannot turn the show off. That's how it was for me, and that's how it is for anybody who's ever gotten into the show. Is you just have to make it through the first 4 or so episodes, and then you'll be hooked.
Jonathan, it's a pleasure to talk to you, man. And your work is incredible. Whether you're doing it for your Bleacher Report stuff, where you're writing these NBA features, or your long form, even longer form stuff in books. I'm a big fan, and I'm glad to know you call the Queen City home now. So thanks for making time. It's good to talk to you.
I really appreciate it.
All right, that's going to do it. It's another episode of Courtside Seats, our Charlotte Hornets podcast. If you've missed any episodes previously, check us out on YouTube, our Charlotte Hornets YouTube channel. You can check us out on Hornets.com, the Hornets app, wherever podcasts are available, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, we're everywhere. And then on top of that, find us an Apple Podcast. You can just search Courtside Seats or Charlotte Hornets, or my name, Kroeger, Kroeger, and then you can search, rate, and review, and subscribe too, and we appreciate that. So we'll catch you guys back here next week. It's going to be another episode of Courtside Seats.